Hello, everyone. Welcome to our evaluation workshop number 3. Thank you so much for joining us today. Looks like we have a great group of folks here already, so we are going to go ahead and get started with looking at planning an evaluation to meet your needs. That's our topic here today. My name is Ari Kapuscinski. I am here today from the Improve Group and joined by my colleagues Becky Stewart and Catherine Lim. And we will be your trainers, conversationalists here today. So you're probably here today because you're doing a little evaluation work as part of your overall jobs. But we have planned 3 hours for today. We may or may not take up all those 3 hours, but after 3 hours with us, you will have some appropriate evaluation terms to use with funders, a pick list of evaluation questions to scope your basic plan, and some feasible ideas for conducting an evaluation in sexual violence prevention work. So you will probably also leave with a lot of questions about how to deepen and implement your evaluation. At the end of our time together, we will suggest a few different resources for you to continue your learning, or you can hire us at the Improve Group if you would like. So I will do a quick round of introductions for the team here today and then get started. Like I said, my name is Ari. I've been with the Improve Group for almost 2 years now, doing work as a consultant and specifically loving qualitative evaluation work and interfacing with communities with lived experience. I will pass it to my colleagues just to do quick intros themselves too. Catherine, would you like to go first?
Thanks, Ari. Hi, everyone. I'm Catherine Lim. I've been with IG for about 9 years, and I support our organization in various ways, including getting to work with many of our clients that work in violence prevention.
Thanks, Catherine. Becky?
Hi, this is Becky. Good to be with you this afternoon. I've been with the Improve Group for over 20 years, and I'd say a particular kind of passion I have in evaluation work is making sure that the evaluation is useful and meaningful, as well as responsive to the community or context where the program is working.
Great, thanks, Becky. So we at the Improve Group, we are a worker-owned evaluation consulting cooperative, and we provide various different services, including evaluation, planning, facilitation, and community engagement, to help support mission-driven organizations. And we know that many of you are already doing some form of evaluation already, so we're excited to share more about it. MDH Sexual Violence Prevention Group did ask us to focus on approaches and purposes to evaluation today, understanding that it's helpful to be able to make the case and make powerful statements for your work, and understanding how your work contributes to larger change. We'll start out with a little bit of housekeeping information. So I'm just going to go over this since we are in a webinar format today. We're trying to accommodate a larger group of folks participating. Unfortunately, we will not be able to be as interactive with you as we normally would like to be. But as you can see here, the Zoom webinar tools are available for you to participate. We do have the chat disabled for the webinar, but we are going to be using the Q&A function. So you can use this button to submit your questions anytime, and we will be pausing to answer any questions after each of our breaks that we're going to have throughout our time here today. Also, if there are any technical difficulties, please use that Q&A button to let us know, and we can try to assist you in whatever ways that we can. Um, we also have a cart captioner supporting us today. If you would like to turn on the captions, the human created captions can be seen in the Zoom window by clicking the CC button / show captions. And they can also be seen in a separate browser window at a link that will be put into the chat shortly for you to see. Hopefully you can access and see that. We are also recording this webinar. So the slide deck that we'll be using and the recording will be made available to you after this webinar here today. And like I said, we will be taking several breaks over the next few hours. So don't worry, you will get some time to breathe, get a drink, get a snack, whatever you need to do. All right, so we are going to just share our agenda, let you know kind of the roadmap for where we're going here today. We are going to start off with a basic kind of overview of what is evaluation, and then we will jump into evaluation planning, including the different types of evaluation, evaluation questions, and then different data sources and methods that you can use in evaluation. And then we will finish out with advice and resources on common challenges that are faced in evaluation. And then, like I said before, while this is a webinar format with only Q&A for engagement, we're going to do individual activities throughout. So to test your memory, get you learning, and then answer any questions that you have through that Q&A format. I'm going to pass it over to Becky to just get us started, get us loosened up, and do a quick poll real quick.
Yes, we want to have create a good solid baseline here with a very rigorous CAT poll. So we have we'll launch a poll in a moment here, and I'll explain the question here on this. You'll see on the slide is how do you feel about evaluation? And we have our various rigorous CAT scale here with different, it's Friday afternoon, so I'm going to fully lean into this. We have different categories that you might want to answer. So the number one, the cat is looking really frustrated about evaluation, throwing its tiny paws up in the air. Number two, that cat is looks a little deflated and is feeling dissatisfied about evaluation. Um, and number three, we have actually looks like potentially a tiny Maine Coon cat who's looking fairly happy and satisfied about evaluation. And finally, we have a leaping orange tabby cat here with a leaping over the moon, feeling so excited and thrilled about evaluation. So those are the different categories. You can indicate your I did give full credit to my colleague Dan for this, your satisfaction about evaluation. Don't stop now. I promise it will get better if you hang in for the rest of the webinar. All right, I'm going to launch the poll and to your relief, put myself on mute. Okay, it looks like we've got almost everyone in. If you'd like to indicate. Evaluation. Okay, I think I'll end the poll here and share our results. This is a beautiful poem that every answer is correct. There's no right answer here, or there's all right answers. Looks like we have a good spread here. Some stats people would love the curve that we have with most people indicated, or about half of people indicated that they are satisfied with evaluation. So that's great to hear. Looks like we've got some good opportunities for improving people's feelings about evaluation, with some folks feeling either really pretty frustrated or dissatisfied about it. We have a few people who are just really loving it, which is always warms our hearts, and a couple people who don't have any experience. So there should be content here to hopefully speak to all of you at various levels of your experience or feelings about evaluation. So it's great to see that, and thanks for participating in our very silly poll.
Great. Thank you so much, Becky. And now we're going to jump into what is evaluation. We will be giving a quick primer overview of evaluation itself before diving a bit deeper. So we'll start off with a definition of evaluation, one of the many definitions of evaluation coming from the American Evaluation Association. Evaluation is assessing the strengths and weaknesses of projects, programs, personnel, and organizations to improve their effectiveness. So, that is, like I said, one of the many definitions. We're going to present another one to you on our next slide, another definition from the Canadian Evaluation Society. Evaluation is the systematic assessment of the design, implementation, or results of an initiative for the purpose of learning or decision making. So, in summary, evaluation is a systematic method for collecting, analyzing, and using information to answer questions about particular projects, policies, and programs, most often about those programs or projects' effectiveness and efficiency. So, in other words, a shortcut is to really think of it as a kind of research that is focused on application for your program or organization rather than academic research, which may be done to explore new areas of knowledge without a specific use in mind. So, evaluation is practical and tied to your program or organization's goals. And now we're going to look and see various questions of what evaluation helps us to answer. What can evaluation tell us and why do we do it? These questions are also a preview for our later overview of evaluation questions in general. So keep these in mind if any resonate for your own work. These questions really guide what data you collect throughout the process. So we really try to avoid collecting data just because you can. And evaluation is really about focusing on what matters to you and the program that you're trying to improve. So, our first question is, are we having an effect? We know that often decision makers and funders in your work are asking the question, how does this work make a difference? And how do we know that this makes a difference? I'll go through what kinds of questions and answers that you can get at with evaluation, starting with this first one. Are we having an effect? This is just another way of asking, are we making a difference? And that next question is really tied to that. What is the effect and how much of it is there? So, really, what difference are we trying to make with this program, project, etc.? The third question, how do we know we are making a difference? So, what is leading to or detracting from that effect? What is the process that gets to this effect? What barriers are we experiencing, you might ask, or what's getting in the way of making a bigger impact is something you might want to explore in your evaluation. And next is how can we determine value of the program or project? And lastly, how can we inform decisions with information? So, decisions could also be about what is most needed, figuring out what is most needed and by whom, or what improvements would be helpful overall. So, looking at all of these questions, what can evaluation tell us? Why do we do evaluation? This list is obviously not exhaustive, but it tells you what kinds of questions you may want to learn more about or take action on. We are going to do our first practice activity. So, like we said, we know this is a webinar format, so you won't get to engage much with each other, but we also know that adult learning calls for us to practice in order to absorb and have new knowledge. So, we're going to have a quick 5-minute pause that's intended for you to engage in the content, and we hope this will help the content stick more. So, first activity is to take a pen and paper. If that's accessible to you, use your preferred tools. You can use a quick sticky note or a notes app on your phone, a blank document, whatever works best for you, and just journal or respond to the prompt questions. So I will read those out here. Now, if you were to prioritize one of the quote unquote big questions for your work today, what would it be? who would care about the answers to this question and why? And you can see we have the previously mentioned evaluation questions listed here. Are we having an effect? What is the effect and how much of it is there? And what leads or detracts from that effect? How can we determine value? And how can we inform decisions with this information? So we're right at 1:15. We will come back at 1:20 and move on a little bit further deeper into evaluation. right. Hi, it's Ari again. So we are coming back together. It's 1:20. Thank you so much for practicing. Hopefully that was enough to get you a little warmed up thinking about evaluation. And we are going to continue here talking about different evaluation types and the terms that you'll encounter when thinking about or planning an evaluation. So looking at evaluation types and approaches, an evaluation approach is an integrated package of methods and processes. So, naming your evaluation approach can be super helpful in communicating the scope of your work. From our perspective as evaluators, we mostly see the use of the terms that we're going to talk about show up in requests for proposals, RFPs, our evaluation plan that we create in collaboration with our clients, and in our report methodology. So, to be honest, you don't have to use these terms to scope your evaluation. You can have multiple different approaches. So, we're just hoping to introduce you to a wide breadth of terms that you can use going forward with your evaluation practice. So, these are the different evaluation types and approaches. So we'll start out by explaining all of them. But as I just said, you can have multiple approaches. So looking at the first one, formative evaluation, this is conducted in the early stages of a program or is to the end of improving program design. And we can provide some examples of all of these different types of evaluation as well. So, common program evaluations combines. Actually, I'm going to go through each one first and then I'll explain kind of the combinations. So, next is a process evaluation, and that is understanding the activities and the work, and it's monitoring fidelity and reach during implementation. So that is process evaluation. And then looking at outcome evaluation, that is really understanding the changes that are happening throughout your program or your project. And then summative evaluation is conducted at the end stage of a program to understand how effective the program was over time. And lastly, impact evaluation is about understanding contribution or attribution. So, how much of a change happened and what created that change. So a common program evaluation combines process and outcome evaluation questions together to kind of encircle the life cycle of a program or initiative. It is important to be careful of doing too much in an evaluation. Um, and Next, if you are asked to conduct an impact evaluation, this should immediately raise a flag for you about the resources you are given to make this happen, because impact evaluation can be a resource-intensive process. Often, these kinds of evaluation need some significant resources to do. So, oftentimes, another thing to keep in mind is that oftentimes people conflate impact and outcomes. So that's another thing to keep in mind as well. Formative and summative evaluation are also terms used to describe an approach, and these two most strongly align with the program stage and life cycle, in addition to describing the kinds of questions that you have. So now I can describe some examples of all of these. Formative evaluations can be helpful as a program in its development. So, like a new program, violence organizations might be piloting to better serve immigrants who are facing increased barriers to getting care. That could be an example of a formative evaluation. For process evaluation, an example could be looking at a program that's empowering youth to be prevention leaders in their communities. So, process evaluation could look at the number of trainings that are provided, how many people attend, and the degree to which the trainings are administered as intended. An example of outcome evaluation, we at IG recently supported MDH to evaluate the Safe Harbor program and summarized who Safe Harbor served, the services that they provide, changes that the program contributed to, and what strengths helped Safe Harbor achieve those changes. So that is an example of an outcome evaluation. Summative evaluation. One example is a project that I was recently on, and it was a project partnering with this program called Advancing Black Home Ownership. And that was conducted at the end stage of the intervention of that program, which was to provide down payment assistance to Black homeowners who are seeking home ownership. So we interviewed those that received that down payment assistance to see how the program affected their journey to homeownership. An example for impact evaluation was we did an evaluation of Green Dot Bystander Intervention Program. This was highly resourced. The 5-year evaluation used a randomized control trial to compare rates of violence in high schools with Green Dot against high schools without it. So the evaluation concluded that Green Dot decreased multiple forms of interpersonal violence perpetration. So I know I threw a lot of examples at you, and I just want to open it up to my colleagues, Becky and Catherine, if there was anything that I missed or other examples that you wanted to lift up for these different types of evaluation approaches.
I don't know that I have a lot to add. All right, this is Becky. Maybe just a clarification that was, well, Green Dot is something that we've had clients use. We didn't conduct that big rigorous impact evaluation ourselves, so familiar to us, but we weren't the ones who did that evaluation. But yeah, I think I think your examples were great. Just one other observation, the reason why we often combine process and outcome evaluation is that it's both helpful to know kind of what occurred as well as what results happened, so that you're not at the end of your evaluation left knowing only what occurred, but not whether any changes happened as well, or you know that changes happened, but you don't have a firm grip on what occurred. So that's the reason why those two pair so well together. That's, I think, all I would add for those examples. Thank you.
Great. All right, and now we will move on to some other key terms that you might encounter when planning an evaluation. The first kind of category being indicators, metrics, and measures. So these are specific observable variables. And at betterevaluation.org, we have a kind of a source that reminds us that as part of an evaluation, it is often important to either develop or use existing indicators or measures of implementation and or results. So using an existing indicator or measure can have the advantage of producing robust data, which can be compared to other studies as long as it's appropriate. So for example, each question on the National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey, the NISVS, is an indicator or a metric. So an indicator from NISVS is people who have experienced stalking in their lifetime. However, it does not have meaning until you connect it with your work itself. So the next term is outputs. So outputs are often really easy to quantify, and this is the evidence that your activities happen. So outputs allow you to be transparent and accountable to the work. It really allows you to ask what did you do with your time and resources. And the other term here is outcome. So that is the change or difference desired or achieved. Outcomes are indicators that show directionality or change. So a potential outcome of your work going off the NISVS indicator could be decreased number of people who have experienced stalking in their lifetime. So indicators, metrics and measures, outputs, and outcome are key terms that you would see in an evaluation. Another key term that you'll hear us talk about is method. So evaluation method or tool is a way of collecting or analyzing data to answer evaluation questions. And we have a list of examples here, including interviews, a survey, propensity score matching, etc., some others, focus groups. You can also get really creative with your methods, which is really fun. So we use the term method to describe what ways we are collecting data. And we also use this interchangeably with the term tool, instrument, or protocol. And sometimes the term method is used to describe an approach or a design methodology. So, for example, randomized control trial is a design methodology, but it's also a method. Next, we are looking at the key terms of attribution versus contribution. So I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but want to explain further. Attribution assigns credit for an idea or works to a source, while contribution is about what one adds or enhances in a collaborative setting. So people want attribution, but your work in the field of sexual violence prevention as a whole realistically should be viewed and described from a contribution lens. What we see and what actually happened are two different things. So this is what makes true attribution so difficult to identify. On the right of this slide, we see a drawing with two dots, one labeled the cause we see and one dot labeled the effect we see. And in between and around the dots, there are lots of arrows and dots that create a complicated web of overlapping lines, but that eventually reconnect back to the two original dots. And just wanted to share a quick quote from the CDC, which says outcomes can be more challenging to measure than inputs or outputs. In addition to long-term outcomes are often difficult to attribute to um, sorry, to attribute to a single program because usually multiple factors contribute to changes in outcomes. So that's what you're seeing with this web. And as an example, your program might work on a long-term outcome of increasing community connectedness as a protective factor against violence. An intergenerational program to connect with elders, with young people in specific communities will contribute to increased connectedness, but so will many other activities people are exposed to. So the takeaway is that it is valuable to measure your program's contribution to that, even if you know that many other efforts are contributing to the long-term change as well. And that's a great thing overall. Next, we are going to look at kind of the purpose of evaluation or the evaluation purposes as divided here. So this slide outlines different purposes, including assessing opportunities and needs, understanding implementation through looking at strengths and challenges. That is process evaluation, as I described earlier. Identifying outcomes of a program, outcome evaluation, and the degree and value of impact. So each purpose has different evaluation question examples listed below. So, for example, in an evaluation where the purpose is to identify different outcomes, some evaluation questions that you might ask include the key question, are we having an effect? What is the effect and how much of it is there? How well did the program work? And to what extent can changes be attributed to the program? And lastly, what were the particular features of that program in context that make a difference? So each different purpose will uh, lead to different questions, but we have seen funders expect all of these purposes from an evaluation before, usually not all at the same time, but this is going to come up in our activity later on. So I will pause here just for you, maybe if you want to take a quick picture, jot these purposes down, but you may want it for our activity going forward. Okay. Hopefully that was enough time for you to take a look. I can wait a few more seconds if we think that's a good idea, but okay. We are going to move on to matching evaluation type to kind of the stage at which your program or project is at in its life cycle. So, on this slide, we have a graphic that shows the different evaluation types, which are on the staircase, on a staircase graphic, and how the evaluation type matches the stage at which your program might be. So, if you're trying to assess opportunities and needs through an evaluation, that might occur before an intervention takes place with the program. So you can see that alignment there. And if you are trying to understand implementation through looking at strengths and challenges, like we said, for a process evaluation, that would probably occur during the program's early intervention, and that can go through the end of the intervention. So it's through the process. And if you're trying to identify outcomes through outcome evaluation, that would probably occur after approximately 6 months of the program's intervention. And then if you're trying to generalize, define a model, plan to scale, or determine the degree and value of your impact, that would occur probably over 1 year after the intervention with the program. So these purposes generally have a relationship to time, though there's always exceptions. This is just a starting place for understanding where your program or intervention is that can help you know what purpose and questions are feasible for your evaluation. All right, so we are on to our second activity here. This will be an opportunity for you to think of a program or initiative that's close to you, and think about what stage of implementation that it's in currently, and start to jot down your ideas about what evaluation approach best suits this stage, to where your program is at and what additional evaluation questions come to mind for you to help you evaluate your program according to the stage that it's in right now. We will be doing this activity and then we will be taking a break. So we'll have about 5 minutes for this activity. So I have 1:37. So come back at 1:42 if that sounds good to everybody here. Hi everyone, this is Ari. Just calling you back in to say it's 1:42. Hopefully you had a good opportunity to practice. We are going to go to a 10-minute break now. So feel free to get up, stretch, have a drink, and use the restroom, get a snack, whatever you need to do. You could also continue practicing. But this is also time to pose any questions that you have in the Q&A, and we will be happy to answer those after the break. So 1:43 now, so we'll come back at 1:53.
Yet, so we'll move right into talking about evaluation planning, and we really encourage you to share any questions you have as we're talking. We'll have plenty of time to get to them. So again, so far we've talked a little bit about an overview to evaluation, different reasons you might do an evaluation, some common terms and approaches to evaluation, as well as how the stage of your program might inform what kind of evaluation is most helpful. Now we're going to get into talking about kind of four key steps to evaluation planning. Then we'll talk about logic models, since those can be so helpful in evaluation planning, and we'll wrap up talking about some common challenges. So while we aren't here today to teach you all the ins and outs of developing an evaluation plan, we want to help you think about the main components. And so to ground it in the work that many of you are doing, we know that approaches to sexual violence prevention can fall into different categories, including promoting social norms to protect against violence, teaching skills, empowering people of marginalized gender, and creating protective environments. And so we'll take that first type of programming, promoting protective social norms, to walk through some examples for planning and evaluation. Excuse me. So planning the big picture parts of your evaluation upfront saves time and ensures useful results of your evaluation. It also helps reduce the chance of collecting data just for data's sake, and it forces prioritization of what you're asking and of whom. The four key steps to plan an evaluation are: first, define your purpose and key audience, identify evaluation questions, select data sources and methods, and develop your timeline and responsibilities. So next we'll walk through each of these steps. Defining your purpose and audience of the evaluation is really helpful to make sure you stop and think and prioritize that audience and intended uses so that that can inform the rest of your decisions. We want you to think about things like who needs the information that you're collecting. Trying to serve too many people with an evaluation might result in an unwieldy scope and lots of different results that aren't ultimately useful. You want to think about how will the results be used. There may be some preliminary purpose that sets you on the path for deciding on your type of evaluation. And think about what decisions will the findings inform. So in our example of, say, a bystander training program to promote norms that protect against sexual violence, you could consider potential evaluation audiences to be the trainers, the participants in the training, and whoever is funding the training, as well as the communities that people live in that are attending the training. A use of the evaluation of the program could be to document how the training is being delivered in order to understand what it takes to do the program. That's like process evaluation, like Ari described. You could also use evaluation to identify any changes experienced as a result of the training, to know whether you should keep doing that training or switch to another approach. That's an example of outcome evaluation. The next step is defining your evaluation questions. When we support organizations to conduct evaluations, we like to offer lots of different evaluation questions since it's such a cornerstone of creating your evaluation plan. This set of 7 evaluation questions is one of our go-to starting places to prompt you to think about what do you care about and what do you really want to know. So I'll read these common types of evaluation questions. Number 1, fit. How well does the work fit and complement other services? 2, design. Is the design right? How well does it address the underlying causes of the problem you're trying to solve? 3, implementation. How well is the program being delivered to meet people's needs? 4, outcomes. Are the outcomes worthwhile? 5, learnings. Where and for whom do your services work best and why? 6, sustainability. How sustainable are program impacts? And 7, overall value. How worthwhile is the program? A key consideration is thinking about your own work and needs. We typically suggest prioritizing 5 to 7 evaluation questions so that you're not committing to too much, which would require considerable resources and be hard to manage. Going back to our example of a bystander training program to promote protective norms, some of our example evaluation questions could be, what are the strengths and challenges in the implementation of the program? Or what changes or outcomes are occurring among people who participate in the training? This is again another way to think about your evaluation questions. So as you can see on this slide, you can think about what's going to be most helpful to you. First, assess opportunities and needs. What data is telling you that your work is needed and for whom is your work needed? Understanding implementation strengths and challenges, or that process evaluation, thinking about how the intervention is being implemented, what's working, what's not working, what leads to or detracts from your effect, and are participants being reached as intended? Identifying outcomes or outcome evaluation is asking, are we having an effect? What is that effect and how much of it is there? How well did the program work? To what extent can changes be attributed to the program? You might think in your work about what contribution your program made to the change, and what were the particular features of the program and context that made a difference. And then the degree and value of impact. How can you determine value? You might be wanting to say that your program is more of a model that can be applied elsewhere versus a more informal approach that might shift. So here we'll do a little activity to help you apply what we're saying. So let's think this through with another example about promoting social norms that protect against sexual violence. Imagine a program is implementing a communications campaign and it got some funding from the public health department to implement the campaign, and so they want some help evaluating it. As we can see on the slide, they're asking, we're trying out some new strategies to get in front of youth, including using new platforms and creating partnerships with a handful of youth to be our influencers. We've never done this before, so it would be good to know if we are reaching our intended audience and what elements of our communication strategy are resonating with youth. So take a moment and think, what evaluation would you want to do in this case? Our answer here is process evaluation because you're really thinking about documenting what you're doing, learning what's working as you go, um, and what's helping you have the effect you want. The next step in planning your evaluation is identifying your data sources and methods. So often people jump right to this step by choosing a tool like surveys and asking questions that might match their grant request or just be the first questions on their mind. But starting with those first 2 steps around your purpose and your evaluation question can really help you make strong decisions at this stage about who to get information from or data sources and how you get that information, data methods. We see a cartoon here on the screen where one person is saying, we're just starting to plan our evaluation. Which methods should we consider? And another person responds, all of them. You want to be open-minded about the best methods for your community and the goal of your evaluation. Data sources can be people, especially in qualitative research, there are people like participants or leaders of an organization. In your field of work with violence prevention, it might also be existing data sets. For example, the Minnesota Student Survey that has data every 3 years on the types of change you might be hoping to contribute to. Data sources can also be administrative, like records you might have of how many people received services in your organization that might be captured in a spreadsheet already. If you're doing communications work, a data source might be analytics available online, or that might look at what reach your communications are having. Methods, meanwhile, are the how you collect data. So people very often use surveys for ease, but there are many to choose from that might better match what you need to learn or want to be able to say about your program. We'll touch on these methods next, and I will just plug if you didn't catch it earlier this week, we did a couple other sessions in the same format that were recorded on surveys and on qualitative methods. So those recordings will be shared along with this one in the future. Here is a not exhaustive list of data collection methods. You see here there's a mix of individual versus group data collection methods, simple versus more complicated, and straightforward versus more creative data collection methods. When you're considering what the best method is for your case, there's a few things that we encourage people to consider. So again, think about what your evaluation questions are. If your question is how many people and who you're reaching, you don't necessarily need a group method. You might have that documented already in administrative data. Quantitative data like a survey or an observation rubric can be useful for understanding how much something's happening or where it's happening, whereas qualitative methods like interviews or focus groups and workshops can tell you more about why or how things are happening. We also encourage you to consider what kind of data your evaluation audience needs, wants, and values. For example, if at the end of the day there's a funder who wants an infographic report, or that's something that community members would find helpful, that might inform more quantitative methods. Also consider context, which, as you all know, can include so many things, but some of what we mean by context is what environment are people in? Where can you meet them where they're at when you're trying to ask them how things are going? And how can your method kind of mirror that and respect that? If you are hosting group trainings over a series of meetings, maybe there's a way to embed a group-based data collection into those meetings when people are already there. If you're going to be asking about something more sensitive, which definitely might come up in your all's work, consider whether one-on-one methods like interviews or surveys might be a more trauma-sensitive approach than a group setting where people might not want to disclose things in front of others. And then consider your own resources and opportunities in terms of skills you have on your team, software you have, things like that. Whatever method you choose, we encourage you to embed evaluation into your work when possible. So again, in this example of a program where people bring folks together for bystander intervention training, sessions could include role playing to practice a new skill. An evaluation method could be built right into those workshops where people have rubrics for observations and that guide them to watch for key knowledge and skills you want people to have. The rubric would be designed to define what it looks like for someone to demonstrate poor, fair, or excellent knowledge of how to intervene in potential violence or other types of skills you want to build, and you can observe and track that during sessions. The fourth step in developing your evaluation plan is looking at timeline and responsibilities. We can tell you evaluation takes time and the devil can really be in the details. This slide shows one simple way to map out the evaluation process for timing and who's responsible. A tip for developing timeline and responsibilities is for the evaluation to be realistic and feasible. At the Improve group, our shortest evaluations have taken 2 to 3 months, and those can include just a single data source and a single method. They can get much longer from there. As you increase the number of methods and data sources and number of participants, you typically need to increase the time allowed. We're going to take another 5 minutes for an activity and ask you to refer back to the notes you've done so far to think about um, data sources. So thinking about what you worked on earlier with Ari, we're asking you to try writing down 2 data sources that could inform your evaluation question. Then for each of those sources, brainstorm 2 examples of what the source could tell you that would help you answer your evaluation question. For example, an interview with a participant in a bystander training group could tell me how participating has changed them in terms of their knowledge levels, confidence to intervene, and other aspects of interest. It's 2:09 now, so we'll take till 2:14 and then come back and talk about logic models. Thanks, everyone. Great. Welcome back, everyone. I hope that was a helpful time to practice what you're learning about. We are going to next talk about logic models. Because logic models can be a really useful starting point or guide to inform evaluation planning. So I'm going to describe the image here. Here we see someone kind of like if you were at a car repair shop, but they are rolled underneath a giant logic model with lots of boxes and lines going different places, and then another person looking a little overwhelmed. And it says, at the logic model repair shop, the repair person, I'm presuming, says, I'm guessing this is for a comprehensive program level of intervention. The point here is to show that it is helpful to have a clear visual map of how your work contributes to the intended change that you want to see. In our experience, we have seen that the process of developing a logic model itself can be helpful for people to communicate with each other about why they think the activities they're working on are needed, as well as to help communicate to external supporters and funders to understand their work. Logic models can also identify gaps in planning, for example, if there aren't outcomes match or activities matching to the intended results you want to see, and you can get on the same page about why you're doing the work. At the same time, one thing we want to clarify is that um, You don't need a logic model to conduct an evaluation, but they can help you figure out what your measures are because the measures might be in the logic model, and that you can have a logic model but not have to measure everything in the logic model. A huge logic model with lots of detail can be really useful for a team to come to a shared understanding about what they're doing and the difference they intend to make, but you don't need to evaluate every potential measure in the logic model. So in a really simple sense, a logic model is a visual representation of the ideas we all have in our minds. We all carry a map in our heads of how things work and why we think one thing leads to another. Laying out those components in a logic model ensures that we're on the same page if we're working on something together and helps you align your goals and outcomes. So here we see a visual with your mission, vision, goal at the top. Then on the left top, your inputs lead to activities, and your activities lead to both outcomes and or outputs, excuse me, and outcomes. And next, I'll talk about each of those components in a little bit more detail. Your mission, vision, and goal serve as a frame for all the elements in the logic model that follow. They reflect your priorities and help you steer a clear direction for future action. Then your inputs, which might also be called resources, are what are essential for the activities to occur. They might be, or they will be used to accomplish the activities and can include financial resources, human resources like staff and volunteers, physical space, technology, equipment, and materials. In your logic model, you want to identify the available resources that you currently have to support your program. Then activities are the actions that are needed to implement your program. What will you do with those program resources in order to achieve program outcomes and ultimately your goal? You want to think through the entire process, for example, with a client from enrollment, what you do working together, and any follow-up to think holistically about activities. And as you can see on this side, activities can range from client advocacy, environmental changes, trainings, organizational level policy change work, case management, campaigns, and community events. Then outputs are the things that specific activities produce or create that can be quantified or qualified in some way. For example, if you are serving families, an output could be the number of families served, or if you're doing community workshops, an output could be the number of workshops held. Outputs tell us about the size and scope of program activities, but they reserve any judgment about the impact of those activities. Next, you have outcomes, which express the results that your program intends to achieve if implemented as planned. Outcomes are the changes that occur or the difference that is made for individuals, groups, families, organizations, systems, and communities during or after the program. Outcomes can answer questions like, what difference does my program make, and what does success look like? And they reflect the core achievements that you hope happen as a result of your program. When you're thinking about defining your outcomes, consider that they should be within the scope of the program's control or sphere of reasonable influence, generally accepted as valid by various stakeholders of the program, phrased in terms of change, and measurable. Excuse me. So next we'll share a few examples of logic models to show you that it really depends on your program what is going to look best for you. So we're not asking you to read everything. I'll just provide a quick orientation of this logic model, which is in what might be seen as a more traditional kind of table, linear left to right format. In this case, you have inputs on the left, and those include things like human resources, donors, and a food truck in this case. Activities follow the inputs, and in this case, that's things like delivering free healthy meals to youth. That leads into outputs, which are again the quantified things that specific activities produce. So, number of healthy meals distributed. And then outcomes, which here are broken into short-term, intermediate, and long-term outcomes. Here's an example that shows a way to incorporate visuals that are meaningful to your program. So in this case, things are also linear, kind of left to right, like the previous example, but we see some elements of nature because the organization has ties to, or their work is related to the environment. As another example, in this case, the client used a medicine wheel, an important cultural symbol, for a culturally grounded program. And so was a good way for them to think about how they do their work. This example especially shows that you can assemble a logic model to align with your program. So in this case, it's not linear. The goal is at the center, and using the different elements of the medicine wheel, in this case, emotional, mental, physical, and spiritual, criteria residents showed the change they were going for and the work that they were doing. On the upper right corner, you see something else we consider a good element for equity, which is stating assumptions and external factors. So that's just acknowledging that your work isn't not occurring in a vacuum, and external factors like systems are also affecting your work. So it's making those explicit. In some of the community level work you may be doing, it can be hard to think of what might make good outcomes, and so it can help make your case stronger to others if you can cite research, such as from centers like the National Sexual Violence Research Center. That center is connected to the CDC and is a great resource for helping think about change, and has resources like one we're showing here for outcomes, indicators, and data sources. In this case, these are some outcomes you could track if you are working on changes at workplaces in your community. So in this example, we see an example outcome of improved policies and procedures, and another example outcome of changed policies and procedures implemented. This NSVRC resource also gives you ideas of indicators you can track and data sources to use to get your evaluation going. This is one part of a helpful resource that we'll share a link to at the end called Evaluating How Activities Contribute to a Particular Policy. We'll take another 5 minutes for an activity here. So we'll ask you to try your hand at a logic model and use a program example in your life. If you can't think of an example, you could think of our bystander intervention training or a consent training for people at a college campus. We'll ask you to write down one activity. So in one sentence, what's one part of the work this program does? One output. So what can I count that shows I did this activity? And one outcome. What is one thing that I would hope changes within 1 month of the activity? We'll come back at 2:31. Thanks, everyone. Great, everyone. This is Catherine. I hope that was a helpful activity to apply what you're learning. We'll next go into another 10-minute break before coming back and talking about some common challenges we see. And again, encourage you to pose any questions that are coming up for you in the Q&A, and we'll address those when we get back. So 2:31 now, so we'll come back about 2:41. Thanks all.
Well, welcome back. This is Becky. If you can come back from your break, we have just one last section of content that we wanted to go over today. We don't have any questions yet in our Q&A, but we'll have more time later for questions, and then we're hoping if you can stay on after our content, we could even have a little bit even more back and forth with the end of our time today. So, as we've been talking about, we started off today talking about what is evaluation and what you can learn through evaluation and some considerations about what's type or purpose might be appropriate at different times for your program, as well as some key terms so you can throw those around like a champ. And then we started talking a bit about evaluation planning and what are some of the four key steps to consider there in your evaluation planning, as well as what are logic models and how to think about what could be useful to you about a logic model. So we're going to probably draw on a lot of that content here as we get into our final section of advice and resources on common challenges. We, we mentioned at the start of our time together today, we were invited or asked to do this webinar by the MDH Sexual Violence Prevention Program. And as we were talking together about what to cover, they mentioned a couple areas of common challenge that they've heard about in the past or heard about in other places from folks in their network, and thought that these might be good challenges to address in our time together today. And I will say these are common challenges. They were not surprises to us and things that are really common challenges for many in evaluation. So I'm glad we'll have a chance to talk about those a little bit today. All right, so common challenge number one is that you overpromise. And so we'll provide some advice here and some thoughts about defining appropriate outcomes using theory to help you. So we have on the right hand another comic. Evaluation comics are really kind of a niche thing, but a colleague, Chris Lissy of Fresh Spectrum, does evaluation specific comics, and here's one that seemed fitting for this case. We have a drawing of I think it's an evaluator pointing to a whiteboard. And saying, so what you're saying is that your low budget school lunch subsidy program, what you've got listed under activity, and then we've got an arrow over to your outcome, which is that you're going to end world hunger. And the two people who are kind of looking on here respond, oh, well, every big idea looks silly when you put it down on paper. So after we're done with our hilarious laughter at that cartoon, we can really see, and even though this is exaggerated and kind of simplified, we could really substitute a lot of different kinds of programming here and have all been caught a little bit in this kind of trap where you might kind of claim something that's maybe a little bit bigger and loftier than maybe you can support, and one in your evaluation. And so one thing to do is just to kind of take a step back, or this is a reminder to take a step back and think about what is realistic for you to achieve. And that's not to dismiss, as we talked about earlier, that's important to remember that you can be contributing to quite big things, but you just need to be really clear about how what are the steps of that contribution unfolding from activities to the outcome that you're hoping for. So some tips that we have is to go back to that theory of change as some of tool that is similar to a logic model that people use, or a logic model. Catherine walked through the different components there. And if you go to some kind of tool like that is connecting the dots between activities and outcomes, that really helps you be clear and communicate as well as implement what you can measure. So if we go back to our example of the bystander training that we've been referring to a few times here, let's say in your logic model for that bystander training, you might list your outputs from the trainings. And some of those outputs might be like the number of people who attend a training. You might also be considering how much training or dosage that you are using that is needed to get people to change their attitudes or behaviors. And then you're thinking, okay, so if this many people attend this much training, what kinds of outcomes might we expect? And you might think about those in the short term. You remember we had logic models that talked about short-term outcomes that happen right away versus longer-term outcomes that take a little bit more time and maybe other contributions and other experiences to unfold. So what you are trying to think about is kind of what is the scope of this change, as you're thinking about how many people are affected and how much activity has happened, then that helps you think about what kinds of outcomes are realistic to name in the short term or in the medium term. So as you're kind of connecting those dots theoretically, it's helpful to connect also with people who are involved in this work, whether that's people who maybe have participated in the program in one way or another, or maybe they're community leaders, folks who asked you to come do these trainings, and they will have good insights about like, yeah, that feels like that could reasonably be expected. If you do this much work with this many people, we might begin to see this change over time. You can also go to some research, like we've talked about a little bit. There's some places for research. We'll provide some different resources at the end of this webinar as well, places you might go to understand where perhaps this has been studied elsewhere and the kinds of outcomes of doing similar work people have seen elsewhere. So those might give you some justification and sense that you are selecting outcomes that are reasonable for what you're trying to do. Um, and then we'll just pitch again that evaluation is something that is ongoing. And as you do evaluation and maybe test different parts of your logic model over time in different evaluation projects, you're going to continue to learn and understand how well your assumptions are playing out in terms of are these activities really resulting in some of these outcomes? Are these short-term outcomes beginning to build and get to these longer-term outcomes? And so the more that you can kind of be paying attention to whether those assumptions are holding by doing some evaluation or learning along the way, that will help you sort of test the realities of your theory about that these outcomes are plausible with the activities that you're doing. So while this comic might seem kind of silly and over exaggerated, we really I will say this is something that is, as I mentioned earlier, easy for all of us to fall into. And whether that's because, you are wanting to do this work because you want to see change in the world and you want to see things happen, and or you're trying to really get the ear or the eye of a funder or supporter, it's easy to fall into. And so just to remember that you're responsible for, if you say that something is an outcome or result of your work, then you hold some responsibility for being able to make the case about that. And that's why it's important for kind of doing your due diligence and thinking about how your theory can be tested and in order to understand whether it really does make the connection between activities and the outcomes that you're wanting to see. So another common challenge that we hear about a lot is that, folks will come to us and say, I've been asked to provide evidence of impact. And that's requested all the time. And we mentioned earlier that sometimes the word impact can be thrown around a little bit, and perhaps everyone's not always talking about it in the same way. So sometimes people might just mean that they want you to talk about changes that are happening or outcomes that are happening as a result of your program. Or sometimes they might be talking about more formally about showing impact, which often conveys that they are wanting you to show that prove the case that your activities have resulted in those outcomes, that those outcomes were for sure caused by your activity. So we have a few suggestions for what you might do in these circumstances. So one is to use existing research as a substitute for doing one of those big studies yourself. So this is maybe the lowest lift if you can find some existing research that is aligned with what you're doing. So, if you can make the case that you are showing that you are implementing a strategy that has been proven successful elsewhere, that's somewhere else, previous to now, someone has done a study and shown that this activity is proven to have these kinds of results, then you can be collecting indicators that show that you're implementing this activity effectively. So you're supposed to do X number of hours of training. Then you say, we know we're supposed to do X number of hours of training, that this strategy, when it's been done elsewhere, has these kinds of effects. And since we know we're doing the program well, then we can draw on the evidence elsewhere that we can have confidence that it's going to result in these kinds of changes. I say that even though I know that the field of sexual violence prevention has maybe a little less evidence available to you than some other fields in terms of looking at impacts at a community level. But there are some great options. We've got again some resources that we'll share out to you at the end of this, and then as follow up to this webinar. So, for instance, the Prevention Institute has some work that kind of talks about how programs prove themselves to be effective and prove themselves to have the results from their program activities that they intend. So there's just we'll have a few suggestions there of some places that you might be able to look. Again, you have to look for alignment here. You know, if a program has been proven to have certain outcomes elsewhere, but those aren't the outcomes that you are wanting to do, or the activities of that program are not really what's going to be most effective for your community and your context, then this is not going to be as helpful of a strategy for you. But if there is alignment between both the strategies and the kinds of outcomes that are important to you, then you can kind of point to that existing research and say, this has been proven successful elsewhere, and we are doing the same thing. Okay, so then another option number 2, is to use mixed methods and ask about attribution. So you can kind of collect mixed methods, means you're using both quantitative and qualitative, or a mix of evidence in your study. And so you might see that through your mix of evidence that people have changed some of their behaviors. And then you can get at that question of attribution, or how to point to the cause of that change being their experience in your program by, drum roll for profound statement here, by asking them to the extent to which your program activity had an effect on their behavior. So that is, you're getting their qualitative insights about that connection between your activities and the behavior changes that happened, as in this example. And so interviews can be a great method of doing this, where you might ask both about what changes they've experienced and to what extent any of the program activities supported those changes. That is a legitimate way to gather evidence. Qualitative data is also evidence to help you understand whether the activities that you're doing are connected to the changes that you're seeing. And then lastly, and we're not trying to be cheeky here, but if you're really going to do a really serious study that proves the connection between the activities that you're doing and changes that you're seeing, that is a kind of a bigger lift, and you probably need to get some help by hiring an evaluator, or hiring somebody with those kinds of skills to at least help you with setting up a study and in order to get at those kinds of questions. These are questions about really proving attribution that really, as Ari mentioned right at the beginning of our webinar, require a lot of resources. And so, if you're getting that kind of request, it's all right to sort of note that and say that those also come with a need for some additional resources. It's not kind of run-of-the-mill program evaluation. I'll also add something to consider if you are getting this kind of request, that really this kind of evaluation is most important or most relevant to do when there's your program is kind of mature. So if you're just new, getting started with something and trying a lot of different things out, making a lot of changes, that's not a good time to do this kind of evaluation. So it's only when you have had you've gone through some of those other types of evaluation we talked about earlier, where you've questioned, are things working at their best? Can we make any changes to be more effective? You make those changes and get more effective. You do some outcome evaluation to understand if outcomes are happening. And after you've done that kind of, your program has grown and evolved and is pretty steady state and feeling successful, then that's when it's maybe prime time to consider doing something like this, where we can do this kind of more deeper resource intensive kind of study that could then justify perhaps like big investments or justify a decision to potentially scale or replicate something in a big way. All right. Now we have more fun times cartoons for you. This is just kind of a funny reminder about attribution. So we've got a little cartoon here of this poor person holding their tummy and thinking, oh, my tummy hurts. And maybe it was the bad tuna I had for lunch, but too bad I don't know. I will never know because I never had a proper control group. So that's just a little funny cartoon as an illustration of that point that we made in the last slide about kind of mixed methods. A lot of times people are able just to tell you whether something is occurring because of another experience, and so not to discount that. All right. And then we did mention, I also mentioned earlier, one of the other strategies that we suggested was using some existing research and said we could share some resources for that. This is a picture of, so it's just like a picture of a page. So certainly don't read it right now, but we will send a link to you. This is from a technical package from the CDC that suggests different types of promising or evidence-based practices for sexual violence prevention. And in it, it outlines some common strategies that are used in the field and lists some outcomes that have been associated with those strategies and the evidence that they have collected of impact from those strategies. So, for instance, bystander approaches have two listed experimental evaluations, bringing in the bystander and then green dot, and it shows how the outcomes for these programs can increase the result or changes that have been shown to happen from these programs of increased positive bystander intervention behaviors. And then again, this resource provides more evidence of impact in the document. So if you're seeing that you are doing some of these strategies, you could look up the studies, or if you're thinking about which strategies to do in order to achieve these same kinds of impacts, maybe this could give you ideas of activities that you could do. And then you can, again, if you want to kind of relate what you're doing to these things that have previously been proven effective, that can help make the case without a heavy lift. So again, we'll provide a link to these resources as a follow-up to this webinar, but that's an example of how you can maybe say, hey, we're doing this, bringing in the bystander training, just like has been done elsewhere, and elsewhere it was proven effective. Okay, just in time for some questions. We have some questions in our Q&A here, so let's turn to those for a moment. Let's see. So first question we have is, would you be able to include a link to the Safe Harbor research and the Green Dot research mentioned today in the follow-up email with the slides and recording? It would be very helpful to see this. I'm going to answer, just put those there, pop it in the Q&A so you can see that question too. So yeah, that green dot, the question came in, I think, right, probably as I was starting to talk about that CDC resource. So that does have some information about green dot and the studies that have been done there. So we'll for sure share a link to that as a follow-up. And then Safe Harbor, I'm going to look in the Zoom windows at my two colleagues. I believe that those reports would be things that are publicly available that could be shared. I'm getting a nod from Catherine, so excellent to do. So yes, we could kind of point the way to that as well. So thanks for asking about that. Another question here. Oh, great. These are great questions. Can you say more about how to deal with interventions that have a broad cross-cultural evidence base as a proven event prevention strategy? In this case, empowerment self-defense, but are frequently still not valued and promoted on a large scale. And there's some resources here for us all to check out here. So that's very helpful. I'm going to pop this over so you all can see this question and some of the resources that are there. I think if I'm getting at the question, there's some, and I might not know the field well enough to be getting at the nuance that you're asking about. So please do follow up if I don't get it here. But there's kind of when you look at some of the reasons or ways that programs can be named as really at this quote unquote gold standard of evidence-based strategy. And there's not very many of them because you go through a lot of hoops, or not hoops, you go through a lot of rigorous research steps that are intended to prove that this program will opt to work everywhere with everyone. And that may not always be what's most valuable for a strategy. So it might be that you want to consider more of a context, may be context responsive in what you're doing, and not trying to make a program that works well everywhere for everyone. And that might mean that it doesn't is not able to go through all these steps of proving the evidence base that are expected in that sort of generalizing model kind of research. So for sure, I would love to hear more about this. Hopefully, if we will be able to move into a little bit more interactive time here. I'd love to hear more about this experience and in your field, more, for instance, about empowerment self-defense. But I will just say a little bit from our practice that while it's helpful to be able to point to these strategies that are really popular and well known because they have this broadly accepted evidence base behind them, what's most important is to get to something that do things that are effective and in your culture and your community. And a lot of times the ways that these other strategies have been tested may not be well aligned with the communities that you're working with, and so they may not be effective for your community. And so that's important to embrace that knowledge and that you have about your community and what will work well. And these kind of broad-based ones have been tested in some cultural communities and not necessarily in all. It was a very wandering answer. I'm not seeing other open questions right now for us to consider. I'm just going to just wrap up a little bit here, and then we are going to turn to the next phase of our webinar. So just some things to remember from today's session. before you turn away today from your computer is maybe to write down three things that you learned or want to remember. Putting pen to paper is really helpful for our memories and trying to remember what you wanted to take away from the time today. And then maybe also you want to think about setting a goal for yourself that includes one thing you'll do differently now that you have this information. So maybe it's an idea you want to try or a shift in how you're doing something. So one thing that you want to do differently. And then maybe put a reminder on your calendar in the next 3 months to kind of revisit your notes. Sometimes we attend these on the end of the day on a Friday or during a busy time, and it's that follow-up can be hard. So a little reminder in your calendar to, I wanted to come back and think about this or try this change out at a calmer time. So I'll give you just a couple minutes here to do those things. 3:06, just take a minute or two here just to write down a few things you want to remember. Maybe identify one thing you want to do differently and schedule time to revisit your notes. Okay, well, next we're just going to flash up a slide of resources. We'll be sending these out, and that will be more helpful to you when we send it out as links that you can follow up for checking out some of the resources that we mentioned during our time today. And we also are remembering that request for the Safe Harbor report as well. So finally, yeah, please do connect with us. Excuse me. We enjoy talking to people about evaluation and would love to connect with you